Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks. Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Continuing Education, SOCE, Diploma Postgraduate Diploma Programs, Diploma in Panchayat Level Administration and Development, BPLAD, BPR1 Panchayats in India. The context: Block 1 Democratic Decentralization and Indian Constitution, Unit 1 Democratic Decentralization and Local Self-Government. Conceptual Framework 1.0 Objectives. After going through this unit, you should be able to understand times the meaning of decentralization, times the meaning of different forms and types of decentralization, times discuss the significance of democratic decentralization, times identify value of local self-government, times analyze the problems associated with local self-governing institutions, and times appreciate conditions leading to the constitutional amendments to examine the constitutional status conditions for the success of local self-government. 1.1 Introduction. Decentralization is an institution reorganizing concept. It involves transfer of authority and responsibility for public functions such as roads and buildings, water supply, delivery of primary health services, etc. from the central government, also state government in a federal system, to subordinate or quasi-independent government organizations, and elected local government, such as a municipality or a panchayat. Decentralization can thus take many forms. When the central government transfers some of its powers and functions to one of its subordinate field agencies, this process is known as deconcentration. By contrast, when central government decides to create elected local government and statutorily devolves functions to such local authority, this is known as decentralization. Deconcentration is basically an administrative act to relieve the central government of some of its workload by transferring some activities to its subordinate agency. But decentralization properly involves setting up of new elected local government institutions which are not the subordinate agencies of the central government. The concept and practice of decentralization has acquired considerable popularity in recent years, especially in the developing countries, primarily with a view to creating more opportunities for people's active participation in governance. 1.2 Democratic decentralization and local self-government. Decentralization as a process of institution building, as suggested earlier, may take many forms. The objectives may vary from country to country and from situation to situation. Accordingly, the decentralization process is adapted to the changing needs of a country and situation. 1.2.1 Meaning of decentralization and democratic decentralization. Decentralization may not be democratic. Prior to the establishment of Panchayati Raj, the development block as the lowest administrative unit of development administration was a bureaucratic setup run by the government officer called the Block Development Officer. This was a case of decentralization, but not one of democratic decentralization. Again, when the state government decides to transfer some of its central functions to the district magistrate, it is also a case of non-democratic decentralization. By contrast, when the state decides to set up a municipality or a panchayat and transfers some of its functions to this kind of a locally elected body, such a measure leads to democratic decentralization. Local self-government. Among many forms of decentralization, what is strongly endorsed by the champions of democracy is a strong, autonomous, and vibrant system of representative local self-government. It is advocated on the ground that it deepens and widens democracy and strengthens the democratic foundation of a country. To quote in this context the famous dictum of Tocqueville, is celebrated democracy in America. Town meetings are to liberty what primary schools are to science. They bring it within the people's reach. They teach men how to use and how to enjoy it. In the form of a strong, autonomous and participatory model of local governance, decentralization creates a politico-administrative space for the local citizens to enjoy extensive and real powers, for local self-management, and for spearheading a local sustainable development process. 1.2.2 Forms and types of decentralization. Decentralization takes many forms, e.g., a. The delegation of responsibility and authority to field units of the same department, which is called deconcentration. B. To a level of government through devolution of authority to locally constituted units of local self-government. Other forms include privatization and deregulation. Decentralization is a relative, complex, and multidimensional process. It is relative in that it describes the distribution of state resources, responsibility, finance, personal or discretionary authority between various institutional actors within the state and/or society against some normative mode in space or time. It is a complex process in that it incorporates and is impacted upon by political, economic, institutional, and cultural factors. Moreover, actual programs of decentralization are a mixture of centralization, deconcentration, and in some cases devolution. Finally, decentralization is a multidimensional process that defines the distribution of power and resources between state and society, the executive, and other branches of the government, at micro level between central and local governments, central government and their field units, local governments and non-governmental entities, as well as at higher levels between governmental units within a federal or international system. Any program of devolutionary decentralization involves the transfer of legislative, political, administrative, and financial authority to plan, make decisions, and manage public functions and services from the central government to local authorities. Deconcentration or field administration is just as important as devolution. There is, however, a fundamental difference between the two. Deconcentration involves intra-organizational transfer of responsibilities, whereas devolution is basically interorganizational as power, resources and personnel are transferred to a new institution endowed with autonomy. Decentralization types. The term decentralization embraces a variety of concepts that need to be carefully analyzed in any particular country before determining if projects or programs should support reorganization of financial, administrative, or service delivery systems. Decentralization, which refers to a process or situation of transfer of authority and a responsibility for public functions from the central government to intermediate and local governments or quasi-independent government organizations and/or the private sector, is a complex, multifaceted concept. Different types of decentralization should be distinguished because they have different characteristics, policy implications, and conditions for success. The type of decentralization usually classified as political, administrative, fiscal, and market decentralization within a country will depend on its design, which will depend on the political structure and administrative issues of that country. Political decentralization. Aims to give citizens or their elected representatives more power in public decision-making. It is often associated with pluralistic politics. Find representative government, but it can also support democratization by giving citizens or their representatives more influence in the formulation and implementation of policies. From the perspective of democratic principles, decentralization then means the distribution of powers between elected authorities. This can simply mean that detailed decisions are made by local government, though always within central policy guidelines and funding arrangements. Advocates of political decentralization assume that decisions made with greater participation will be better informed and more relevant to diverse interests in society than those made only by national political authorities. Administrative decentralization and its many forms. Here the aim is to redistribute authority, responsibility, and financial resources for providing public services among different levels of government. It is the transfer of responsibility to various subsystems for the planning, financing, and management of certain public functions from the central government and its agencies to these sub-systems. These can be field units of government agencies, subordinate units, or levels of government, semi-autonomous public authorities or corporations, or area-wide, regional or functional authorities. These subsystems may be territorial units, as under federalism, or bodies entities enjoying considerable, entitled to self-sufficiency. Decentralization is based on the principle of subsidiarity, which means that a function would be placed in the hands of the level which is best suited to perform it. The three major forms of administrative decentralization, deconcentration, delegation, and devolution each have different characteristics. Deconcentration, which is often considered to be the weakest form of decentralization and is used most frequently in unitary states, redistributes decision-making authority and financial and management responsibilities among different levels of the central government. It can merely shift responsibilities from central government officials in the capital city to those working in regions, provinces or districts, or it can create strong field administration or local administrative capacity under the supervision of central government ministries. A third type of administrative decentralization is devolution. When governments devolve functions, they transfer authority for decision-making, FMANs, and management to quasi-autonomous units of local government with corporate status. Devolution usually transfers responsibilities for services to elected self-governing local governments, like municipalities and panchayats, that elect their own councils, raise their own revenues, and have independent authority to make investment decisions. In a devolved system, local governments have clear and legally recognized geographical boundaries over which they exercise authority and within which they perform public functions. It is this type of administrative decentralization that underlies most political decentralization. Delegation is a more extensive form of decentralization. Through delegation, central governments transfer responsibility for decision-making and administration of public functions to semi-autonomous organizations not wholly controlled by the central government, but ultimately accountable to it. Governments delegate responsibilities when they create public enterprises or corporations, housing authorities, transportation authorities, special service districts, semi-autonomous school districts, regional development corporations, or special project implementation units. Usually these organizations have a great deal of discretion in decision-making. They may be exempt from constraints on regular civil service personnel and may be able to charge users directly for services. Fiscal decentralization, financial responsibility is a core component of decentralization. If local governments and private organizations are to carry out decentralized functions effectively, they must have an adequate level of revenues either raised locally or transferred from the central government as well as the authority to make decisions about expenditures. As experience shows, fiscal decentralization can take many forms, including, among other things, A. Self-financing or cost recovery through user charges, B. Co-financing or production arrangements through which the users participate in providing services and infrastructure through monetary or labor contributions, C. Augmenting expansion of local revenues through the levy of property or sales taxes or indirect charges, D. Statutory intergovernmental transfers by way of general or specific tied grants from the that shift general revenues from taxes collected by the central government to local governments for general or specific uses, and E. Authorization of municipal borrowing and the mobilization of either national or local government resources through loan guarantees. In many developing countries, local government units possess the legal authority to impose some forms of local taxes, but the tax base is usually very weak. Local governments are often reluctant to make full use of the local tax base for fear of losing popularity and the dependence on central Government subsidies is so ingrained that IIOL till the attempt is made to exercise the statutory that authority to impose taxes, economic or market decentralization, the most complete forms of decentralization from a government's perspective are privatization and deregulation because they shift responsibility for functions from the public to the private sector. A fully centralized system runs the risk of being inefficient because it is poorly informed and does not create proper incentives. As outcomes of policies are dependent upon implementation by bureaucracies, the administration responsibilities are transferred to those levels where the corresponding tasks arise. One expects the most effective execution of tasks at the local level. This has led to the acceptance of the idea that implementation concerns should guide policy from the bottom up, rather than vice versa the other way. Privatization and deregulation are usually, but not always, accompanied by economic liberalization and market development policies. They allow functions that had been primarily or exclusively the responsibility of government to be carried out by businesses, community groups, cooperatives, private voluntary associations, and other non-government organizations. Privatization can range in scope from leaving the provision of goods and services entirely to the free operation of the market to public-private partnerships in which government and the private sector cooperate to provide goods and services. 1.2.3 Significance of local self-government. Relationship between decentralization and democratic governance has a fairly long history in political thought. One need only turn to the writings of Jacques Rousseau and his observations on the functioning of Swiss cantons and their role in serving as vehicles for the preparation of the citizenry to engage in democratic governance to find some early speculations upon the relationship between democracy and decentralization. Equally relevant are the writings of Alexis de Tocqueville and his assessment of democratic governance in the newly formed United States, and in particular the importance of local government and civil society for the maintenance and development of democratic institutions. J.S. Mill, one of the noted champions of local representative institutions, characterized local self-governing bodies as being both of educative training in democratic citizenship, functional values, efficient local services management. In recent years, the seminal Race. Urch of Putnam on Italian regional development has brought out refreshing ideas about social capital as trust, togetherness, and unifying bonds which, according to Putnam, is very vital as social capital for effective local development. Local go-government creates opportunities for active people's active participation in the governing process. Democracy thus becomes a kind of real-life experience for citizens in their day-to-day living. That is why local government has been regarded as a democracy-deepening and legitimacy-producing institutional device. Also, a well-functioning local government, and in this way of functioning it ensures transparency, openness and accountability in local governance. Government at the local level is visible and open. It is easily accessible to the local public. People can ask questions about why the local services like water supply or garbage disposal are not being properly supplied or managed. Because of visibility, the public can check corrupt practices easily and seek redress. There is thus a large body of evidence that suggests that well-functioning local government has an educating influence on citizens. It enables people to participate in the governance process, it improves governance and ensures better management of local civic services. Conclusion: local government promotes democracy by dispersing power away from the centers. It is also helpful for local development because of the opportunity it provides to the local people for active participation in local development. 1.3 Democratic decentralization. The Indian context. In post-independent India, planning was introduced in 1950 to bring about speedy socio-economic development within a plan frame. The country had to work hard to remove in as short a time as possible the legacy of colonial rule, poverty, ill health, malnutrition, and many social and individual disabilities. 1.3.1 Planning and Development, search for viable, local institutions. When it came to the institutional question or who will plan and implement the numerous development projects locally in remote rural areas, questions were raised about the urgency of creating properly equipped viable organizations. Because of the colonial hangover as well as the need for quick fix remedies, planning had been top down with heavy reliance on the bureaucratic machinery. Initially, the operative instrument easy at hand was the bureaucracy, which was found experienced and technically efficient. There was, however, soon a realization that unless people are made direct participants in development, the projects would not reflect people's real needs and people would remain mere beneficiaries and objects rather than actual actors and subjects. Also, sustainable development, not just one short seasonal exercise, needs viable local institutions grounded in local people's will to bring about authentic local development. Experience in most developing countries had been that development was expert-led and bureaucratically conceived and driven. There was hardly any concern about what are the actual needs of the people and how can the assets created such as a school building or a tube well be maintained. There was thus wastage on one side and a serious mismatch on the other between what the felt needs of the people were and what were being planned and delivered on the ground. Against this background of failed development efforts, thus to make development truly people-centric, the idea of people's direct involvement in development activities emerged in most of the Third World. After the failure of state-led development efforts, it was keenly felt that authentic development must be built on people's own initiative, arid vision, and by harnessing social energy and local resources as vital inputs, resource in development. More importantly, people will come to own development as their own when conceived and implemented by the people themselves. They will also contribute in kind and coin and see to it that the assets created in the development process are properly maintained. Since the inauguration of planning in India, the role of local government in local development has been again and again emphasized. For instance, the first five-year plan wrote, local self-governing bodies have a vital part to play in the field of development. We consider that the general direction of policy should be to encourage them and assist them in assuming responsibility for as large a portion of the administrative and social services within their areas as may be possible. The second five-year plan reiterated this policy of local development by local government. The second plan reviewed the functions and effectiveness of the village panchayats in the light of the development programs they were called upon to carry out. The second plan it stressed the need for the integration of the village panchayats with popular organizations at higher levels and advocated greater devolution of powers and functions to the local bodies. The stage was thus set for the Balwantarao Mehta Committee to go for an all-out search for fashioning an appropriate institution to give shape to the ideas of the Planning Commission. 1.3.2 Balwantarao Mehta Committee, an establishment of Panchayati Raj, the now famous Mehta Committee, was set up on 16 January 1957 by the Committee on Plan Projects, a body established by the National Development Council to secure the maximum possible economy and to avoid wastage arising from delays and inefficiencies. The Committee on Plan Projects had actually set up a team for the study of community projects headed by Balwantarao Mehta, a member of the Lok Sabha, later Chief Minister of Gujarat. The terms of reference of the study team were first to study and report on the community projects and National Extension Service with a view to ensure economy and efficiency with special reference to problems connected with the organic linking of village panchayats with popular organizations at higher levels. Secondly, the study team was also to study and report on the reorganization of district administration so that democratic bodies should take over the entire general administration and development of the district or the subdivision, perhaps other than such functions as law and order, administration of justice, and certain functions pertaining to the revenue administration. The reorganization of district administration was, however, not mentioned in the original terms of reference of the study team. The study team's report has been acclaimed, very rightly, as an outstanding document that went into great length on the basis of evidence as to what ails development administration and what institutional innovation is needed to make development democratic and participative, with people placed at the center of things. Referring to the Planning Commission's vision, the Mehta Committee point observed the proposals of the Planning Commission for the second five-year plan, as accepted by the Parliament, stressed the need for creating, within the district, a well-organized democratic structure of administration in which the village panchayats will be organically linked with popular organizations at a higher level. Note the diagnosis of the Mehta Committee before making any recommendation, as it commented, admittedly, one of the least successful aspects of the CO and in .s work is its attempt to evoke popular initiative. We have found that few of the local bodies at a higher level than the village panchayat have shown any enthusiasm or interest in this work, and even the panchayats have not come into the field to any appreciable extent. An attempt has been made to harness local initiative through the formation of ad hoc bodies, mostly with nominated personnel and invariably advisory in character. These bodies have so far given no indication of durable strength nor the leadership necessary to provide the motive force for continuing the improvement of economic and social conditions in rural areas. It was in this background of institutional gap and inadequacy that the Mehta study team searched for an alternative institutional design to enlist popular will and support and to install a system of democratic and sustainable development. Times, in the Indian situation, the sentiment for decentralized governance was nowhere better expressed than in the ripe observations of the old Balvantarai Mehta Study Team Report Committee on Goioi, 1957. So long as we do not discover or create a representative and democratic institution which will supply the local interest, supervision, and care necessary to ensure that expenditure of money upon local objects conforms with the needs and wishes of the locality, invest it with adequate power, assign it appropriate advances, we will never be able to evoke local initiative in the field of development. This was the basis of democratic decentralization in India. Prima facie, the Mehta Committee's observations highlighted the instant need for decentralization, in the instrumental sense decentralization for the sake of development. But, on close inspection, one discovers here also a serious search for the fashioning of an appropriate institution of grassroots democracy in rural India. This should be clear from the committee's initial comment on the Community Development Program. To quote the committee report, while operating through the people's local organizations, that CD program simultaneously strengthens the foundations of democracy on which our constitution stands. There was a realization that the state or bureaucracy was not necessarily the best agent to pursue development as a universal good, or to deal with the problems of poverty, unemployment, and ill health and malnutrition, inflation. There was therefore on for more people-centric, decentralized local government to enlist people's active support in the management of local affairs and to make development reflect the felt needs of the people. Mehta Committee made a clear distinction between decentralization and delegation. In their view, the former is a process whereby the government divests itself completely of certain duties and devolves them onto some other authority. By contrast, the process of delegation does not divest the government of the ultimate responsibility for the actions of the authority to whom power is delegated. The committee, accordingly, recommended the creation of a single representative and vigorous democratic institution to take charge of all aspects of development work in the rural areas. Such a body, if created, has to be statutory, elective, comprehensive in its duties and functions, equipped with necessary executive machinery and in possession of adequate resources. It must not be cramped by too much of control by the government or government agencies. It must receive guidance which will help it to avoid making mistakes. In the ultimate analysis, it must be an instrument of expression of local people's will in regard to local development. The concept and structural institutional idea of a three-tier Panchayati Raj with organically linked three tiers Gram Panchayat at the bottom, Panchayat, Samiti at the middle and the Zilla Parishad at the apex emanated from the well-thought-out recommendations of the Mehta Committee. The states, however, depending on their administrative tradition and convenience, could adapt the model to their specific situations. To quote the chairman in this context, we really do not want to pin down other state governments to a certain pattern that we might consider as worthwhile considering. So, there are bound to be experiments in this vast country. Some will accept the blocks. Some may accept the tehsils and some may continue to work through the districts. All that we would like to emphasize is the necessity and the imperative necessity of a real transfer of power to the people's representatives. Government of India, 1958. 1.4 Constitutional status of local self-government. In our original constitution, local government was included as an item in state list of subjects. The states have varied in their interest in local government, and most states have been reluctant to part with powers and resources. Also, due to political competition, often there would be different parties at different levels of government. Particularly when the state government will be in the hands of a party and the local government institutions will be in the hands of a different party, the state would be usually reluctant to give powers and financial resources to local government. On flimsiest ground, local government would be superseded and run by state's own officers. Many official committees and advocates of local government, supporting local government in the interest of both democracy and people-led development, therefore, insisted that local government should be given constitutional status, like other two levels of government in India. The first committee to advocate consideration of constitutional status was the Ashoka Mehta Committee, which was set up immediately after the formation of the Janata government at the centre in 1977. Next in importance is the L.M. Singhvi Committee in 1986, which pleaded for conceptual clarity in regard to the status of Panchayati Raj. The committee thought the Panchayats were considered more as convenient instruments for use by the state governments than as self-government units. Its recommendation was, therefore, to accord constitutional status to Panchayati Raj as third-tier government taking the cue from the Singhvi report. Rajiv Gandhi's government at The Centre came forward in 1989 with the 64th Constitutional Amendment to grant constitutional status to Panchayati Raj. The move, however, was severely criticized by most state governments as being a surreptitious way of taking away the state's power and control over local government. After this abortive attempt, following the elections in 1991, the Congress government brought forward a fresh bill that ushered in the new generation Panchayati Raj as constitutional entity much like the centre and the state. After a long drawn-out debate and discussion thus, local government both municipal government in urban areas and Panchayati Raj in rural areas has been accorded a constitutional status under the landmark 73rd for rural areas and 74th for urban areas. Constitutional amendments 1992 to new schedules were added to the constitution, the 11th schedule with a list of 29 functions and the 12th schedule with a list of 18 functions. On this basis, the state legislature is to endow the panchayats and the municipalities with such powers and authority as may be necessary to enable them to function as units of self-government. In brief, the landmark constitutional amendments provides for a. Broad structural arrangements for both types of local government, b. Participative elective local government with direct people's participation in Gram Sabha at the village level, and ward committee at the level of an electoral constituency in a municipal area, c. One-third seats reservation in local government for the women and the SCs and STs in proportion to their population, d. State Election Commission. 2. Conduct local government elections at regular intervals. E. Fresh election within 6 months in case a local body would be dissolved by the state before the expiry of its 5-year term. F. Planning power of local government keeping in view economic development and social justice. And G. Intergovernmental fund flow through the constitutory of State Finance Commission at 5 yearly intervals. Truly, therefore, local government, both urban and rural, have been transformed radically into grassroots democratic governments with proper functions and resources and people's direct participation in local governance and development. The future would, however, depend as much on states' attitude to help and foster as on people's will and active participation in local governance. The Second Administrative Reforms Commission, which has just reported Local Governance, October 2007, on various aspects of governance reforms, paid special attention to the issue of strengthening further our scheme of democratic decentralization in the country. As the Commission has argued, there should be some core principles guiding the development of local self-government. To quote the Commission, these core principles include democratic decentralization as the centerpiece of governance reform in the country, the principle of subsidiarity, which means that what can be done at the lower levels of government should not be centralized at higher levels, a clear delineation of functions entrusted to the local bodies, effective devolution in financial terms, and convergence of functions for the citizens as well as citizen-centric governance structures. 1.5 Summary. Now, after completing the reading of this lesson, you should be in a position to answer the following questions. Times what is meant by decentralization? Times what is the meaning of democratic decentralization? Times what do we understand by the expression local self-government? Times what is the significance of local government for democracy and development? Times how and when was democratic decentralization conceived and introduced in India? Times what are the core principles identified by the Second Administrative Reforms Commission to strengthen democratic decentralization? Times when and under which constitutional amendments local government was accorded a constitutional status in India. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.